There's a Toyota being built right now in a factory outside Shanghai that has absolutely nothing Japanese underneath its bonnet. The battery, the motor, the entire electric drivetrain, all BYD. Not licensed technology dressed up with a different badge. Actual BYD hardware sold under a Toyota nameplate to Chinese customers who are increasingly indifferent to which manufacturer built what. If you'd suggested this to Toyota's engineers a decade ago, you'd probably have been shown the door. This is, after all, the company that turned "we build it ourselves" into a management philosophy other manufacturers still study in business schools, and yet here we are. The obvious read is that Toyota's been caught out, that the company everyone assumed was too disciplined, too methodical, too Japanese to lose ground in electric vehicles, has quietly admitted defeat and gone cap in hand to a rival. It's a tidy story. It's also probably wrong, or at least incomplete, and it's worth working out why, because the answer says a fair bit about where the entire car industry is heading, including what turns up in British driveways over the next few years. Start with what's actually happened in China, because that's the part most coverage glosses over. New energy vehicles, the catch-all term for full electric and plug-in hybrids, now account for more than half of all new car sales there. Not a niche, not early adopters, half the market. And that shift happened fast enough that Toyota and Volkswagen both watched their combustion and conventional hybrid sales drop by somewhere between 15 and 20% within about a year and a half. For context, that's the kind of decline that normally takes a recession, not a change in consumer taste. For anyone who's followed the UK's own bumpy relationship with the ZEV mandate, the arguments over 2030 targets, the manufacturer fines, the general sense that everyone agrees EVs are coming but nobody agrees how fast, there's something familiar in watching Toyota get blindsided by the pace of change rather than the direction of it. They didn't misjudge where the market was going, they misjudged how quickly it would get there. And the reason that matters so much comes down to one unglamorous fact. Batteries are absurdly expensive to build well, and building them well takes years, not quarters. In an electric car, the battery pack is often 30 to 40% of the entire production cost. Get the chemistry wrong, get the supply chain wrong, and your margins are gone before the car's even left the factory. Toyota faced a genuinely brutal choice. Spend years and billions building battery expertise from scratch while the Chinese market moved on without them, or find a shortcut. BYD, as it happens, had already spent that time, which makes sense once you remember BYD didn't start as a car company at all. It started in 1995 making batteries for mobile phones and only got into vehicles later. That backwards route into the car industry means BYD controls its entire battery process in-house from raw cell to finished pack, in a way almost nobody else does. And the chemistry they landed on is worth understanding because it's not the same bet most premium manufacturers made. Most electric cars at the upper end use nickel manganese cobalt batteries, good energy density, but expensive, and with a genuine risk of thermal runaway if something goes wrong. BYD went the other way, with lithium iron phosphate. Cheaper materials, none of the reliance on cobalt or nickel. A much longer usable life, and, critically for a company as safety-obsessed as Toyota, chemistry that's inherently more stable. They also rearranged the physical structure, stacking long, thin cells directly into the pack, rather than grouping them into bulky modules first, which gets them roughly 50% more energy density in the same volume. If you want the number that actually persuaded Toyota's engineers, though, it isn't in a spec sheet. It's in a nail penetration test, the industry's nastiest stress test, where a nail is driven straight through a fully charged cell. A standard nickel-based battery put through that test spikes past 500 degrees Celsius almost immediately and catches fire. BYD's blade battery, under the identical test, stays somewhere between 30 and 60 degrees. No smoke, no flame. For a brand built entirely on the word reliable, that result probably mattered more in the boardroom than any range figure or acceleration time. None of this is a sudden romance either. Toyota and BYD set up a joint venture back in 2019 specifically for electric vehicle development, split 50-50, each side bringing what the other lacked. BYD supplies the platform, the battery, the motor, and the software. Toyota supplies vehicle engineering, suspension tuning, its own quality control, and this is the part that's easy to underrate. Several decades of the kind of brand trust that doesn't get built quickly. The result is a saloon sold in China, built specifically for that market, with BYD's battery and motor sitting under Toyota's own body engineering and safety standards. It launches at a price that undercuts most of what Toyota normally sells, with a choice of battery sizes offering somewhere north of 500 kilometers of range, and rapid charging that takes it from 30 to 80% in under half an hour. What's genuinely interesting isn't that the car exists, it's what it proves. That Toyota can take an already proven battery and motor system, wrap Toyota-level engineering and quality control around it, and get a competitive product to market in a fraction of the time it would have taken to build the whole thing from first principles. That's not a company giving up on doing things its own way. It's a company being unusually honest about which battles are worth fighting right now. Worth pausing on how odd this would have looked from a British perspective even 5 years ago. Two direct competitors fighting for the same customers, quietly co-developing the most important component in the car. Motoring journalists would have called it a scandal. Now it barely raises an eyebrow because most of the industry has quietly accepted that pure rivalry doesn't really work anymore when the barrier to entry, battery expertise, is this expensive and this slow to build. You can see the same logic playing out, in different forms, across Europe. Manufacturers licensing platforms from rivals, sharing charging networks they'd never have shared a decade ago, even splitting the cost of software architecture with companies they're still competing against on the showroom floor. It's not friendliness, it's arithmetic. And it isn't a one-way favour either, which is easy to miss if the story gets framed purely as Toyota needed help. BYD gets something out of this that's arguably worth more to its long-term ambitions than the revenue from selling battery packs to a rival. Building cars for its own domestic buyers is one thing. Being trusted enough by Toyota, a brand that built its entire reputation on caution and reliability, to have its battery technology sit inside a Toyota-badged car is a different kind of validation altogether. It's the difference between being seen as a strong domestic manufacturer and being taken seriously as a genuine global supplier, which matters enormously as BYD pushes further into markets like this one, where its cars are already a common enough sight on UK roads that most people no longer clock them as unusual. That's actually the detail that changes how this story should land here compared with how it landed in America. In the US, BYD is still largely a mystery brand, barely sold, mostly known through trade war headlines. In Britain, it's already a known quantity, a manufacturer selling saloons and small SUVs at prices that undercut plenty of the competition, sitting in the same conversation as an MG4 or a Cupra Born when people are shopping on value. So the twist here isn't a mysterious Chinese company you've never heard of is now powering Toyotas. It's closer to the battery brand you've probably already seen on a driveway near you is now good enough that Toyota, of all manufacturers, is willing to build around it. That's a very different and arguably more unsettling story for anyone still assuming Japanese engineering sits a tier above what's coming out of China. Because here's the bit that rarely makes the headlines. While all this is happening, Toyota hasn't stopped developing its own battery technology. It's just stopped pretending it can do everything at once. There's a solid-state battery program in the background, targeting a commercial launch around 2027 to 2028, aiming for ranges beyond 1,000 kilometers And charging times measured in minutes rather than hours. It's an expensive, long-term bet, and it's being funded largely by a hybrid business that still sells well over 3 million vehicles a year worldwide, and generates the kind of cash flow that lets a company take its time on the next big leap, something BYD, for all its battery expertise, doesn't have in the same way. Seen like that, the arrangement looks less like surrender and more like triage. Borrow proven technology to stay relevant in the market moving fastest right now. Keep the profitable global hybrid business funding the long game. And use the breathing room to develop something genuinely next generation on your own terms, rather than being forced to compete today with tomorrow's unfinished tech. It's worth being a little skeptical of the solid-state promise too, if only because Toyota isn't the only manufacturer that's been talking about it for years without much to show. Every major player from CATL to a handful of well-funded startups has made similar noises about ranges beyond 1,000 kilometers and charging times measured in minutes. And the gap between a lab demonstration and a factory producing packs at scale has swallowed more than one confident timeline before. Toyota's advantage isn't that it's promising anything wildly different from its rivals. It's that it can fund a decade of expensive, unglamorous development work without needing it to pay off next year, which is precisely the luxury a company burning cash on EVs alone doesn't have. Whether that reads as clever or as the first sign of a company losing its grip depends entirely on how the next few years play out. And that's honestly the more interesting question than anything happening under one saloon's bonnet in Shanghai. Rivals building each other's cars used to be almost unthinkable. Now it might just be how the industry survives the next decade, whether that's Toyota and BYD in China, or the partnerships likely to emerge closer to home as British and European manufacturers face the same battery cost problem without China's manufacturing scale behind them. There's already a version of this playing out quietly across the continent in joint battery ventures and shared software platforms that would have been unthinkable in the era when every manufacturer insisted on building everything itself. The badge on the bonnet is starting to matter rather less than what's actually underneath it, and that's arguably the bigger shift here. Not which Japanese company borrowed which Chinese battery, but the fact that doing so no longer counts as news within the industry itself, even if it still makes for a good headline outside it. If you've got a view on whether this is smart positioning or the start of something more worrying for Toyota, the comments are open. Genuinely curious what people make of it. And if this sort of breakdown is useful, subscribing means you won't miss the next one.